Welcome back to JOyNews Prime. Now, former President Jerry John Rawlings has refuted a number of claims made by former appointee Professor Ahwoi in a book he recently published, Working with Rawlings. The former president, in the detailed response to the book, gave his own account of some of the events, including a phone call he received from the late President Mills from South Africa, informing him he was no longer interested in contesting the 2000 elections, which brought him to power. Now, my colleague Elton Broby is joining me in the studio with details of the former president's response, which reached JOyNews in the last few hours. I mean, it's important, Elton, for us to get to the bottom of this matter. We need a background to all of this. Break it all down for us.
So remember the book written by Professor Ahwoi, Working with the Rawlings. He made some allegations, some allusions in the paper, and attributed it to Mr. Rawlings. Now, Mr. Rawlings, after the release of this particular book, made some comments, but this is the first time he's officially responding to all the issues raised against him in that publication. And this is an 11-page response released by the Office of the President, of the former president, in response to the book written by Professor Ahwoi. Now, some of the pointers in this particular book includes Mills' private call to him, Mr. Rawlings, and this was in 2006. Also, the 2008 NDC campaign, attack Kwabena Kuma, and we are talking about Atade Mocheman. Also, he talked about his vision, his legacy. He goes on to talk about the founder of the Fourth Republic and whether or not he was in favor of the 1992 Constitution, Nana Konadu and the NDC, the sacrifice and what he describes as betrayal. Also, the April 2000 Congress and a few others.
Yeah.
Now, let's zoom in on this phone call he had with the late Professor Mills. Now, according to Mr. Rawlings, in this response to Professor Ahwoi, after his landslide victory in 2006 NDC primaries, candidate Mills traveled to South Africa for medical treatment. Whilst in South Africa, Mills put up a call to the president, Rawlings, and indicated his desire to forego the candidature for the presidential election owing to his medical state. Now, following this conversation, according to Mr. Rawlings, he held a meeting with some leading members of the party to express concern about the state of candidate Mills' health and urged him to identify somebody within the party who could step in. According to the statement, Mr. Rawlings is on record as having suggested that some known personalities in the party should position themselves to demonstrate that the NDC had enough presidential materials. Now, the book made reference to the fact that Mr. Rawlings had called Ahwoi, senior brother of Professor Ahwoi, and impressed on him the need for him to put himself up to lead the NDC in the 2008 general elections. And according to Ms. Ahwoi's book, the two of them met Ahwoi, Ahwoi, and Kwesi Ahwoi, and decided to rather support the late Mills in his presidential bid. Now, according to Mr. Rawlings in this response, owing to urging some members of the party to position themselves for a potential contest was in no way an attempt to undermine, sabotage, betray, or malign Professor Mills, as the author shamelessly inferred in his book. Now, according to him, more disappointing is the impression created that he was and is unaware of that critical phone call from Professor Mills to President Rawlings. It is rather, according to him, telling of him to deny this well-known crisis merely in his bid to derail and denigrate the genuine effort of former President Rawlings to arrest a crisis. Now, the book also spoke about the relationship that existed between Mr. Rawlings and the late Mills, and what may have occasioned the frosty relationship that existed during the presidency of Professor Mills. Now, Mr. Rawlings has been explaining the genesis or the foundation of what came out to constitute that frosty relationship that existed between the two. And according to him, the failure of the Mills government to investigate the assassination of the Yana and 40 of his elders was one of the issues. Two, President Mills' inability to look into the death of Alhaji Issa Mobila, the late Northern Regional Chairperson of the CPP. The failure of the Mills government to investigate and prosecute genuine fraudulent activities within President Kufuor's administration. Indeed, in the book, reference is made to the fact that the late Mills stopped an ongoing agenda that was in motion to prosecute some functionaries of the Kufuor administration. According to Mr. Rawlings, he was in favor of that prosecution, but that did not happen. And this was one of the key issues that bottled up that disagreement between the two of them. And lastly, the lack of dedication of the party ideals of probity and accountability, as well as the monetization of the NDC internal electoral process. And according to these 4 issues were the foundation for their rather frosty relationship that existed during the Mills presidency.
There's also the bit about the book where Kwame Ahwoi himself talks about his relationship with the Rawlings, which wasn't really, a smooth one. Did he also respond to that?
And this refers to whether or not Mr. Rawlings was in the position to accept the outcome of the referendum that mooted the idea for a constitution to govern the country. And Mr. Rawlings is quite emphatic in his response to Professor Kwame Ahwoi in this book. According to him, prior to the return to constitutional rule in 1992, he had initiated and supervised a process of transition to constitutional rule as early as 1986 through the actualization of the district assembly concept at a primary grassroots democratic organ. Subsequently, the National Commission on Democracy sought opinions from Ghanaians on the best form of democratic governance to adopt. Eventually, according to him, the former president was presented with a report and recommendation for an expansion of the district assemblies system into regional and national assemblies, where individuals would nominate themselves for election. For him, he has never shied away from stating that he is not a supporter of multi-party democracy because it tends to allow a minority to manipulate and rule the majority and brings about division. In his own words, in spite of a strong reservation, he will accept the integrity of the information from his team to adopt a multi-party system of democratic governance and actually stood as a presidential candidate in both 1992 and the 1996 elections. And due to his faith in his team and desire to prioritize the national development agenda, he chose not to exercise his veto ahead of Steve, despite his reservation about multi-party system. So this is, according to him, is a far departure from what is contained in the books, trying to give the impression that he was against the 1992 Constitution.
I've had a number of comments on that, but this is certainly a matter that has just begun, and we'll be keeping our eyes on, and of course, getting to the bottom of this whole issue of whose story or who is telling the right story with regards to the ex-president, Jerry John Rawlings. But